Welcome to History at the OK Corral. Don't forget to subscribe, hit the like button, leave us a comment down below, and share this episode with a fellow history lover. And now, on to tonight's episode. Late September 1776, Harlem Heights, New York, Commander-in-Chief George Washington of the upstart Continental Army has just secured a critical battlefield victory in a clash against the notoriously stout Black Watch Highlanders and their Redcoat compatriots. It was a much-needed reprieve from the successive losses the Americans had suffered against the British Empire that summer. With significant losses at the Battle of Long Island and Kips Bay, control of New York City had fallen into the hands of King George III once more. As Washington miraculously managed to elude total defeat in the twilight of both battles, General Howe marched his troops north to Harlem Heights to expel the rebel colonists from New York City proper for good. A daring tactical move by the American general, led by Lieutenant Colonel Thomas Knowlton of the well-stocked New England Rangers, saw the colonial forces drive forward into the advancing British, then take their flank with an attack circling the Rangers that inflicted heavy casualties upon the British before Washington pulled his forces back as munitions grew sparse for both sides. The stalemate elevated the spirits of the fledgling American forces who had been underfed, marginally trained, and on the run from General Howe's forces since their first exchange upon Long Island. It was a bittersweet victory for Washington, as Lieutenant Colonel Knowlton was cut down in the fight, as were a number of other officers. Knowlton had also been in charge of operating the first American espionage ring at the commander's request. A few key prisoner exchanges with the British would help Washington shore up his chain of command with seasoned veterans. However, Washington would also lose a valuable asset in New York City when the young Nathan Hale, one of Knowlton's own Rangers turned spy, was arrested and hanged by British forces as a citywide crackdown took place following a massive fire that threatened to engulf the Empire City after the American army withdrew. Washington wrote a nuanced request to Congress imploring them to provide him with men that were to be conscripted on a permanent basis, with salary, pension, and land grants as part of the offer to recruit and maintain a considerably more professional fighting force. Congress declined their request and would continue to put off doing so for years to come. On October 11th, in the waters of Valcour Bay of Lake Champlain, in upstate New York near the Quebec border, the United States Navy engaged in one of the first battles of the Revolutionary War, and to that effect, one of the first in its history. The Americans under the command of Benedict Arnold had drawn the British fleet into Valcour Bay in an attempt to diminish their opponent's inherent advantages. When the exchange broke in favor of the Royal Navy, an attempt to escape from the British up to Crown Point faced severe weather that stalled the American retreat and resulted in the vast majority of the young Navy's ships being grounded, destroyed, and burned. The Americans managed to inflict some damage upon the British, but would suffer far greater losses themselves, to the toll of 200 casualties, with several critical ships destroyed, including the USS Philadelphia. The British losses were tallied at 40 casualties and 3 gunboats lost. As consequential as this battle would be to the Americans' efforts, it wasn't the most pressing issue of the day for General Washington to address. At Throgs Neck, a small peninsula extending out from the edge of the Bronx, 4,000 British and Hessian troops were transported on 80 sails that navigated through Hell Gate into Long Island Sound, landed, and threatened to trap Washington's army between themselves and the Crown troops in New York City. Howe was once again attempting to turn the Americans' flank, which he had done to great success on Long Island. Yet the Royal General soon discovered he had made a grave miscalculation. The terrain consisted of thick marshes that forced the Crown troops through 2 bottlenecks with stone fences lining the nearby roads. The lands were highly favorable to American defensive positions, with a colonial officer stating to Washington, "I think if they are well lined with troops, we can make a considerable slaughter, if not discomfort them totally." Washington would manage to halt the invading force with just 2,000 of his men. This action served as a much-needed dose of reality for the American commander, rousing him to the notion that Howe was actively moving to cut him off from an exit path out of Harlem. On October 16th, Washington convened a council of war in his Harlem Heights headquarters in the Morris House. The main army would head out the next day for White Plains to the north, with a meager garrison of 1,200 men left behind to man Fort Washington upon the Hudson River, with the tall task of holding the fort while preventing the passage of British ships. On the 18th, 3 miles north of Throgs Neck, thousands of British soldiers came ashore. Had Washington waited just 2 days longer, he would have been enveloped by the British. Now that he had escaped once again, however, General Howe did not give chase. Then, on the 21st of October, the Crown troops advanced into New Rochelle, in Westchester County. The main contingent of the Continental Army arrived in White Plains on the 22nd, with Washington setting his headquarters at the Elijah Miller House, a 600-acre farm located 2 miles north of town. Washington set his defensive lines at White Plains extending out across a 3-mile line, bookended by a lake on the left and Chatterton Hill on the right. This 1-mile ridge held the key to the entire American entrenchment. Dense trees lined the southern end of it, and the Bronx River ran just below. Washington, by some glaring lack of foresight or tactical misstep, did not put any fortifications upon the hill, instead stationing several hundred militia upon it, of which he had desired to remove from the main body of troops due to behavioral concerns brought upon by their juvenile predispositions, and then had neglected it thereafter. The commander-in-chief had failed to even explore the grounds at large of White Plains until the morning of the battle. As Washington finally engaged in an eyes-on inspection of the lines on October 28th, the House vanguard were spotted by his skirmishes. The general rode atop Chatterton Hill. His second, Charles Lee, pointed to the north, stating that was the preferred ground they should be positioning themselves within. As Washington and Lee began to trek towards the site, they were called after by a light horseman. "The British are on the camp, sir." Washington turned about and said, "We've now other business than reconnoitering," then dashed off towards camp at full gallop. Upon arriving at the center of the line, he informed his officers in a cold and direct manner to take their respective posts and do the best they could. The general then took priority in reinforcing the small militia assembled atop the hill with a few pieces of artillery and 1,000 Continental troops who took up their arms behind stone walls that lined the crest of the hill. Then the militia moved to the lower edge of the hill on the right. Howe arrived at the American lines that day with just 13,000 men in tow, most of whom were grizzled German Hessian mercenaries, known for their penchant of taking sadistic liberties when their foe was finally prepared to acquiesce. The British commander saw at once the crucial placement of Chatterton Hill and attacked it directly with 2 columns. The first, the Hessian Brigade, under the direction of Johann Gottlieb Rahl. They held their fire and charged upon the militia lining the extreme right of the hill. They expelled the colonists from their position with relative ease, then carried on for the crest of the hill. The second column, another Hessian denomination, attacked the front of the hill, but were bogged down as they struggled across the Bronx River and absorbed heavy fire from the Americans. The 2 British regiments to their rear became restless, finding their way across the stream at a section of considerably less depth. Then they mocked the Hessians as they advanced up the hill, still in column. The halted Hessians could only watch as the advancing British line was met with a heavy assault of grape shot. Yet they persisted in spite of their substantial losses, and in due time, the Hessian professionals were advancing in support of their rear. The Maryland regiment then attacked downhill, attempting to scatter the surging column, but amidst the chaotic melee, they could not organize themselves into an effective offensive force, and were scattered about. Still, the artillery of the Americans inflicted further punishment. The legend of Sleepy Hollow is drawn from the lore of this battle, as tales of a Hessian cavalryman beheaded by a cannonball that was seen still galloping up the ravine were spread by Americans. In a reversal of fortune for the colonials, the British artillery then went to work upon them in devastating fashion. A member of the Connecticut Regiment recalled bearing witness to the work of just one projectile. A cannonball cut down Lieutenant Young's platoon, which was next to that of mine. The ball first took the head of Smith, a stout, heavy man, and dashed it open. Then it took off Chisholm's arm, which was amputated. It then took Taylor across the bowels, and then struck Sergeant Garrett of our company on the hip, and took off the point of the hip bone. Those men with their legs and guns and packs, all in a heap. With the militia to their right in full retreat, and the Redcoats pressing towards them with bayonets fixed, the Continentals broke apart and fell back. Washington would pay a heavy toll were he to now attempt to take back the hill. Instead, he pulled his troops back to installations due east of White Plains. The defeat had jarred a still reeling American force, in spite of the fact that British and Hessian casualties numbered a total of 276 almost doubled the amount incurred by the Americans. But the bitter taste the Continentals were left with came predominantly from the regret of a missed opportunity. Having begun with such an advantageous position atop Chatterton Hill, and a doggedly determined foe willing to shed substantial blood to dispossess it from the Americans, they had failed to capitalize on the chance to inflict significant carnage upon their pursuers, and more importantly, to secure a psychological victory over what had proven to be, at this stage, a superior adversary. Perhaps the greatest missed opportunity belonged, yet again, to General Howe, who once more deferred the chance to pursue after a retreating Washington. Instead, Howe spent the next 3 days considering his options before deciding to attack on the morning of October 31st. Amidst word of the British movements, and under cover of night and heavy rainfall, Washington disappeared into the ether once again, dispatching with his troops to the north and raising everything they could within White Plains as they made their exit, burning barns, slaughtering livestock, and leaving many Americans homeless in their wake. The apprehension General Howe displayed in his lethargic pursuit of the Continental Army garnered him the nickname Granny Howe from his men. This said, of course, in jest and only around specific company. A former officer of Howe would write, "Sir William seemed to have calculated just the amount of time needed for the enemy to make their escape." A range of theories have been floated by scholars and historians as to what brought on the British commander's predisposition for such complacency. Howe would even be questioned directly after the war by his own government as to why he had not pursued Washington more aggressively when given the chance at White Plains. The general could only muster the laconic retort, "For political reasons." Attempting to ascertain what he meant by this, historians have debated several possibilities. In all likelihood, it stemmed from a gentlemanly desire to negotiate a surrender without having to procure a complete annihilation of the Continental Army. Yet, the floated possibilities spanned from his not wanting to expose a loyalist spy who had been feeding him intelligence on Washington's plans and locations, to a powerful influence above him within the government that had handed down an edict to guide his actions beyond what is understood about the British designs on war, and lastly, and perhaps most glaringly, that the mistress he had taken in Boston during the months-long siege of the city, the wife of British naval officer Joshua Loring, had preoccupied his mind and usurped his better instincts. Judge Thomas Jones, a loyalist historian, compared Howe to Mark Antony, declaring, "Sir William sacrificed an empire for the charms of his Boston Cleopatra." In early November, Howe would abandon White Plains and head back to Manhattan, where he stated he had unfinished business to attend to. Nevertheless, after another defeat, the outlook for the Continental Army heading into the winter was beyond bleak. It would take bold and cunning action from General George Washington to reinvigorate his men's purpose and claw the young nation back into this epic fight. And he would devise a plan to do just that in 2 short months' time, on the night of Christmas, 1776. But Washington's fabled crossing of the Delaware is, for tonight, another story for another time. Thank you for joining us on this episode of History at the OK Corral. Be sure to click the like button, share this episode with a friend, and become a subscriber. Also, if you'd like to support our work and gain early access to episodes, as well as ad-free viewing, you can become a member of this channel by clicking on the Join button, or click the link in the description below to become a member on Patreon. Thank you again for watching, and we'll see you next time on History at the OK Corral, home of history's greatest shootouts and showdowns.